The news came out on Thursday that the Dolphins had some trade talks with the Pittsburgh Steelers surrounding tight end Jonnu Smith. Jonnu's seeking a new deal and would like to stay with the Dolphins. What should negotiations look like? I got you covered here on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krebs, lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting, author of Touchdown Miami on Substack, NFL staff writer for A to Z Sports. Want to give a special welcome and shout out to our everydayers, because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it. You're on the Locked On Network. Today on the show, I've had a couple of days. We obviously did the emergency podcast on Thursday, which became the Friday episode of the news that the Dolphins had talks with about Jonnu Smith with the Pittsburgh Steelers. And what I've really tried to do is zoom out, right? It's very easy in succession as things happen, and this is the next opportunity for the Dolphins to do the right thing with a player under contract and wants a new deal. Right? There's a lot of PTSD in this fan base as it pertains to, well, Jalen Ramsey got a new deal, and that had multiple years left on it, and that has since gone nuclear. We're on Jalen Ramsey trade watch at any minute now. Tyreek Hill had his contract adjusted. It was not adding more years, so it was technically not a contract extension, but it was a reallocation of finances, and then a guarantee of more salary that was left that was currently unguaranteed before they did the adjustment. But here's the big difference for me as I try to objectively look at the Jonnu Smith situation, and that includes who is Jonnu Smith as a player, what impact did he have on the team, where was the impact good, how did he benefit from the other players around him within the offensive scheme, how do you want the offensive scheme to be different this year? Compartmentalizing all of that, along with how is it different than Jalen Ramsey and Tyreek Hill? And the biggest one is Jonnu Smith's in the last year of his contract. He has 1 year remaining. It's for the 2025 season, and then he will be a free agent. And there is an element, as you put yourself in Jonnu Smith's shoes, this is an opportunity to take advantage of a very productive year last year and secure more long-term financial flexibility and stability and financial freedom. And it's a big moment as an individual player, right? But the Dolphins and their business dealings last year at the beginning of the season, the Dolphins got burned on both hands with both of those. So I understand why Dolphins fans here, player X wants new deal, has deal remaining. You say, no, just play your deal, right? Like, we're done doing that. But I do feel like that is leaning too much into the recency bias of that central theme that I've had for a lot of my own personal insights and opinions that I formed, which is you want to pay the right players, right? And paying the right players is not just paying the most talented players, because if you were trying to collect the most talented team, yeah, Jalen Ramsey would be here this year and you wouldn't be entertaining trading. And I had a few exchanges with folks on social media over the weekend, and I'd rather have 75% of the player who's 100% bought in. And that's not what the situation is with Jalen Ramsey. And I refuse to pull my wool over the eyes and pretend like everything would be A-okay and we'll sit around the campfire singing Kumbaya if that's the case. Jonnu Smith doesn't have any of that on his track record, right? And that's the other thing about comparing this situation to both the Ramsey and the Hill situations. Tyreek Hill had questionable decision-making off the field before he got to Miami. Jalen Ramsey did the same thing to the Rams that he's doing to the Dolphins now. And if you try to keep him and play hardball with him like the Jaguars did, don't forget Jalen Ramsey missed games and sat out with an injury. Air quotes, injury. Before getting traded, and he forced his way to the Rams. And with $21 million hanging in the balance, I'm not going to sit here for a guy that doesn't want to be here and play hardball. Now, this is not a Jalen Ramsey or Tyreek Hill show, but it's important to note the differences between the two players. And this is its own unique negotiation point that you're entering into, but I think there's a lot of things that are different that I'm not willing to just put it into the, well, you did extensions last year and they weren't good, so don't do extensions this year and make them play on the deal. I'm willing to talk ball because when I sit down and I look at the facts of Jonnu Smith, not just 2024 Jonnu Smith either. There are some guys that are getting financially more than Jonnu Smith, where I think Jonnu had to pay the price of the contract that he signed in New England. That was a really rich deal. I think it was $12 million per year, and it was signed in like 2021. And let's be honest, those Patriots offenses sucked. They were horrible. They had no clue what they were doing. So then he gets out of that. He comes off of that contract, and kind of the stigma is he's an Arthur Smith merchant because he went back to Arthur and had another reasonably productive season. But he's a skill and role specific kind of player, right? But when you look at financially where he was last year and where he's going to be this year relative to not just the record-setting production of this year, but even his record production, Jonnu Smith has a point. Drew Rosenhaus has a point. And I'm willing to hear them out on that if I'm in the shoes of being the Dolphins. And I want to start with what Drew Rosenhaus had to say. Recently, one of his local TV appearances offered this on behalf of Jonnu Smith. Here's what I will say on behalf of my client. Jonnu would definitely like to stay in Miami. That's his first choice. This is where he lives in the offseason. He had a record-breaking season last year. It was the best season ever for a Miami Dolphins tight end. He broke the team record for receptions, receiving yards, and touchdowns for a tight end, and was the team's single Pro Bowl player. He's an incredibly valuable part of the team. He went to college at FIU. His dream team is the Dolphins. Hopefully everything works out where he can stay in Miami. Jonnu Smith wants to be here. That in and of itself is a nice box to check relative to some other guys. And the fact that Jonnu did have the production that he did, and you knew if you got into some tough moments in coverage, Jonnu Smith would make some plays for you. It's exactly what you hoped he would be when you pursued Jonnu Smith. Now, how it all fits within, we talked on Thursday night last week about the ramifications of a different five-man blocking surface and an inline tight end and being more 11 personnel present. And we talked about how in the offseason messaging that Jonnu Smith has got from his coaches, they talked about being a better blocker, right? And this, I don't use Pro Football Focus as the be-all, end-all anything. I did my own film grading last year, and I can tell you Jonnu Smith graded for me as a below-expectation blocker last year while playing mostly in the slot and not in an inline position. But I could tell you from Pro Football Focus rankings as just, this is something the team will point to, right? The team's going to have its stats and data points that it points to. And Jonnu and his team is going to have stats and data points that they point to. And not all of it's publicly available, but some of it is. And one that the Dolphins, I'm sure, would latch on to is, well, Jonnu, you were ranked 136th out of 143 qualifying tight ends in run blocking last year. So as we sit down and we have the negotiation, this is what Tua Tagovailoa talked about this last offseason, about how sometimes when you're in the midst of a heated negotiation, things can get a little uncomfortable at times because the team who's really invested in you and wants you to be successful, but they're arguing their point for like a financial strike zone, starts talking about, well, we didn't really do this all that well. We don't do this. So we can't pay what this guy got because this guy gives this and you don't. And this happens for every team, by the way. I know if you're just in the weeds of the Dolphins, it feels like a lot of this has happened with the Dolphins, and they kind of did this in some degree with themselves. And some of it was just kind of the cycle of an infusion of draft picks in 19, 20, and 21, and all those contracts now maturing, and you need to make decisions with those players and determine who to commit to, and whether you're committing to the right players is a different story. But this kind of stuff happens with every team where these negotiations can get a little contentious. They can get a little uncomfortable. But at its core, Jonnu Smith was a very productive player who probably has a few years left of similar peak production window left in his career, which is part of the reason why with a year remaining, but also entering into a contract year and having this kind of success, he'd like to continue to stay here. But I want to give a little bit more on Jonnu Smith's perspective, the things that are his arguments before we get into kind of the sliding scale of tight end contracts across the league, where the Dolphins might be angling for his contract to land versus where Jonnu Smith and his team could be asking for this contract to land. So All of that's coming your way next here on Locked On Dolphins, so stick with us. As a small business owner, your work doesn't end when the clock hits 5 o'clock. Your business is always on your mind, which means when it's time to hire, you need a partner that works just as hard as you do. That's where LinkedIn Jobs comes in. When you clock out, LinkedIn clocks in. LinkedIn makes it easy to post your job for free. Share it with your network and get qualified candidates all in one place. Post Your Job is LinkedIn's new feature that can help you write job descriptions and then quickly get your job in front of the right people with deep candidate insights. It's no wonder 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn helps them find high quality hires. And here's a pro tip: add the hashtag hiring frame to your profile picture to double your reach to qualified candidates. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. Post your job for free. Terms and conditions do apply. So here's where Jonnu Smith, regardless of how high you think an extension should go or anything like that, if the reliability of Jonnu individually relative to being a complementary piece amongst the other offensive weapons that the Dolphins have and the bubble that kind of put the team in offensively last year, 32nd in the NFL, his current contract in annual average salary amongst tight ends in the NFL, 32nd. He is scheduled to be 30th in the NFL this year in cash and was 30th in the NFL in cash received last year amongst tight ends. Is 14th on the roster this year in cash owed, including behind backup quarterback Zach Wilson, who signed a one-year, $6 million contract. He ranked 11th in the NFL in cash owed as the team's lone Pro Bowl player, and I get it, Pro Bowls are whatever, and Pro Bowl versus production doesn't necessarily mean that's where you rank in the hierarchy of the team, but he wasn't inside the top 10 players in compensation on the team. I think you can make a reasonable case that Jonnu was one of the 10 best players on the team last year. As the backdrop to that, from a raw statistics perspective, he was 5th in the NFL in receiving yards by tight ends last year. He was tied for second in touchdowns by tight ends last year. He was 4th in the NFL in receptions by tight ends last year. And again, this is the other side of the Pro Football Focus publicly available data point. The blocking was 136 out of 143, which is a point in the Dolphins' favor. He was 5th in receiving grade for tight ends in the NFL last year. So I'm sure that would be pointed to. I'm top 5 at my position in this. And top 5 salaries is $13, $14, $15 million, right? This is the roof just went up on tight end salaries with Trey McBride in Arizona got 19 and George Kittle got 19.1. I don't think that's the kind of door that we're knocking on, though. But when you look at names like Tommy Tremble signed for more in Carolina than what Jonnu did on his new deal. John Bates is like the 3rd tight end in Washington and got a new deal that was $7 million per season. Well, none of those guys had the stigma of coming off of and I'll use air quotes here, failed last big contract. Like Jonnu did not live up to the contract that the Patriots gave him, but a lot of that wasn't really Jonnu's fault. I'm not going to say they would have made Calvin Johnson look like Devontae Parker, but that offense was not where it needed to be from a design, from a scheme, from a perspective, play calling perspective, any of that. Like they genuinely were piecemealing stuff together as they went in New England. The other point for Miami, Jonnu can point to the raw receiving production stats, and he can point to the tight end market as a whole with some of the names. Colby Parkinson in Seattle is getting $7.5 million per season, right? Versus Jonnu's getting he's getting less than 5. I've seen it reported as 4.8. Spot Track has it as 4.09. Is it incentive money that's the difference there? Regardless of what the formal number is on the contract, there are significantly less impactful players at the roles that they have, even if they're not asked to be primarily flex tight ends, who are getting multiple $1 million more than Jonnu, in part because Jonnu had the stigma coming off of the New England Patriots contract when he was waived by Atlanta. The other point that Miami has in their favor is the versatility as far as alignment and usage. Amongst the top 12 tight ends in targets as far as passes thrown their way in 2024. Jonnu ranks 11th out of the top 12 with the percentage of snaps that he took as an inline player, 26%, 1 out of every 4, effectively. The only player that was lower is Mike Gesicki at 8%, right? You want to talk about a guy that's just a big wide receiver. That's Mike, right? And to Jonnu's credit, Mike never saw a tackle that he could break in his life. Jonnu has that ability at hand. But he's a guy who plays detached from the core. On passing downs, it was 3 out of every 4 snaps was detached from the core in some way, shape, or form, which makes you more of a slot receiver. And you expand that from the top 12 tight ends in the league in targets last year to the top 50 tight ends in targets last year. There was only 2 other names that had a lower percentage of snaps on passing downs in line than Mike Gesicki and Jonnu, or not Mike Gesicki, who was dead last at 8%, but had a lower inline percentage on passing downs than Jonnu Smith. It was Mark Andrews and Taysom Hill, who's a glorified single wing quarterback sometimes. So Jonnu ranked 46th out of the top 50 players as far as being able to play in line on passing downs, never mind what happens on rundowns. So as I'm the Dolphins and I have my negotiations, that's a big point of the argument for me is you're not a one-dimensional player, but the utilization in the running game, your utilization as far as where you're lining up at the passing game, and the blockades that potentially puts on us from getting other eligibles that can help us space the field in different ways out on the field, there's a blockade there. It's because I can look at your raw numbers and look at your targets and look at your receptions and look at your yards and look at your receiving touchdowns and agree, yeah, you were great last year. You're top 5 in all of those major raw statistical categories. But when I try to isolate Jonnu's contribution to that versus the impact of Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle and the passing offense and the movements and the shifts and the motions, and it paints kind of a layered, convoluted picture that's difficult to isolate variables in and put quality and value on. But that's what we're going to try to do here, because I don't just want to look at the tight end market, right? Because paying Trey McBride in Arizona $19 million per season going into his age 25 season, he's got his whole next contract will be done before he turns the age that Jonnu was right now. So it's not a one-for-one to just say, hey, here's the tight end market, right? Because age is a part of this from Miami's perspective too. You're pointing at and saying, you're going to be 30 at the start of the season. So what does that look like for our size of a potential financial commitment? What does that look at for the longevity of a potential financial commitment? Some of those are not easy answers either. So I've whittled down the market, and I'm looking at contracts that have been signed since 2022 to tight ends age 29 or older. And I have the top 10 contracts that have been signed over that period of time. What is the percentage of cap strike zone on those? What's the raw value of those? What does their production look like in those? How did they age? That's where we're going next here on Locked On Dolphins. So stick with us. I have this sorted as a percentage of cap. So the annual average salary and that figure as a percentage of that year's salary cap is how I have this filtered, because it's been an argument for me is that's a much more meaningful number than just the raw figures because of the growth rate of the salary cap in recent years. George Kittle, for example, from a percentage of cap at the market reset deal that he just did at age 31, is almost 1.5% lower than the contract that Darren Waller signed as an annual average salary as a percentage of that year's cap when he signed his new deal with the Raiders in 2022. And that one brilliantly flamed out. And what's very apparent to me is the last 2-3 years, the growth rate, even as a percentage of cap perspective, the growth rate of these tight end contracts is not accelerating, right? It's been one of the positions that's kind of got bogged down, where you've seen guards and the spending at guards go way up, You've seen some safety swelling that's happening right now. The interior defensive line has been a marquee because it's become more of a pace and space game, and your ability to control line of scrimmage with fewer players has become more paramount. Tight ends are what makes tight ends also hard is at any given point in time, snapshot, recent NFL history, there's been like 3 or 4 really special tight ends, and there's a big gap. And those ones that are really special and can do all the things, the George Kittles of the world, Travis Kelce, not necessarily now, but in his prime, what those guys could do makes them a very unique game changer for game planning against a team. So I want to give you the full rundown. This is the top 10 contracts since 2022 with their annual average salary as a percentage of the cap for contracts signed to tight ends that were age 29 or older. Darren Waller has the highest. It was 8.17% of the cap. And I'm not a math guy, but I do have my calculator here. The salary cap this year is $279.2 million. If he signed that deal today at 8.17%, it would be equivalent to $22.81 million annual average salary. It obviously was not that. And George Kittle holds the tight end annual average contract record that he signed with his this year, which is second place on this list. And that was $19.1 million. He signed that at age 31 for his age 31 season. But it's 6.84% of the cap. So it's a lesser commitment relative to this year's cap than Waller's was when he signed his. Travis Kelce, who signed his at age 34 last year in 2024, is third on this list at 6.71% of last year's cap was the annual average of that. Big drop. Zach Ertz signed in 2022. He was coming off of 74 receptions for 763 yards and 5 touchdowns in 2021 between Philadelphia and Arizona. Age 31 season, 5.07% of that year's cap was the annual average of that contract when it was signed. And then fifth place, this is the only other contract in the last 4 years that's been signed that exceeded over 4% of that respective year's cap for the annual average. It was Evan Ingram signing with the Broncos, and that was $11.5 million. That's equivalent to 4.12% of this year's salary cap. He had a down year, Evan Ingram, last year in Jacksonville, 47 for 365 and 1. He was 1 year removed from 114 receptions for 963 yards and 4 touchdowns. So 114 receptions for like 8 yards a catch. Those the only 5 that exceeded 4%. So if I'm the Dolphins and I'm coming to the negotiation table, 4% is kind of a hard line for me. Like, Jonnu Smith had a great year last year. He didn't catch 114 balls. Now, he had twice as many touchdowns as Evan Ingram did in 2021. I think that's where the negotiation can start to get a little contentious between Rosenhaus and Smith's camp versus the Dolphins is the classification of that one. Because I certainly don't think, Waller had a couple of 1,100, 1,200 yard seasons. George Kittle's George Kittle. And Travis Kelce's Travis Kelce. Even prime Zach Ertz, not last couple of years Zach Ertz, but prime Zach Ertz, and he was coming out of that prime when he signed this deal in 2022 at age 31 at 5%. Kind of the primes and the track record of those players, I don't think it's particularly equivalent to the kinds of numbers that Jonnu Smith, both in 2024 and prior to 2024, put up. So I think that kind of sets the ceiling in the negotiation is kind of the Evan Ingram contract. But the next 5 down, things get very interesting. Tyler Higbee signed his in 2023. He was coming off of 72 catches for 620 yards and 3 touchdowns. Age 30 season, it was 3.78% of the cap. Hunter Henry signed last year. He signed his big contract in New England, came the same year Jonnu Smith signed his. And Henry had signed for $12 million per as well. But the new deal that he signed after those 3 years was in 2024, age 29, 3.52% of the cap. He was coming off of 3 seasons in New England, in which he caught 60, 50, and 41 passes for 613, 603, and 509 yards. Hayden Hurst in 2023, age 29 season, 3.23% of the cap, was coming off of 52 receptions for 414 yards and 2 touchdowns in Cincinnati in 2022. Mike Gesicki this year, 3.04% of the cap, age 29 season. is coming off a year last year in Cincinnati, which he caught 65 passes for 665 yards and 2 touchdowns. Gerald Everett is the next of age 29 or higher, the last 4 seasons, 2.35% of his cap in 2024, on which he had caught 58 and 51 passes in 2 years with the Chargers, 2.35% of the cap. So you range from number 1 is 8.17. Number 10 on the list is 2.35. You've got a massive strike zone. Now, I'm sure if I'm Jonnu Smith in his camp, what I want to do is I want to negotiate the Ertz contract. I think everybody can probably agree that Jonnu Smith, even with as good of a year as he had last year, the body of work does not measure to prime Darren Waller, prime George Kittle, and prime Travis Kelce. Right? Like I just don't think you're going to get up above this, and the drop is 6.7% to 5%. It's almost 2%. It's a massive number. It's like $5 million per year against this year's salary cap. But if I'm Drew Rosenhaus, I'm coming to the table and I'm pointing to the Ertz contract, the Ingram contract, and I'm saying 4 or 5% annual average. That's going to be between 11.5 and what's 5% of this year's cap. Shame on me, I didn't have this done ahead of time. $279.2 million. 5% of that is 13.96. I'd be willing to bet, and Dolphins fans say, I think Johnny's only asking for a couple $1 million. Yeah, right. No way. Not off the numbers that he just posted, not off the growth of the salary cap, not relative to what these other guys are producing and what kinds of contracts they got. Can't look at raw numbers and say, we'll just sign him to what Colby Parkinson got. Give him Mike Gesicki money. And Gesicki at 3%, that's the scraping the bottom of the barrel of these kinds of contracts. And Jonnu last year outproduced Mike. He outproduced Hayden Hurst when he signed his deal in 23. Outproduced Hunter Henry in all 3 of his seasons when he signed his latest deal in 24. Outproduced Tyler Higbee. And that's the thing, is Hayden Hurst, Mike Gesicki, those are flex guys. Gerald Everett, he's a flex guy. Hunter Henry's an inline player. Evan Ingram's a flex guy. Zach Ertz is kind of a do-it-all player. So you get out of that upper tier, that top 4 that we talked about, you got skill-specific type of players. They're not sitting here trying to get an extra $2 million. They're probably talking about double, triple the pay. And if you get leery and queasy about that, I understand. Adam Schefter it was Ian Rappaport made the point, though. He teased this on Pat McAfee on Friday. He said, when Ramsey comes off the books, some of the financial commitment the Dolphins have made to Jalen Ramsey is going to come off, but probably not all. He's expecting the Dolphins to eat some more of Jalen Ramsey's salary to get whatever they're going to get when they offload Jalen Ramsey. That recoup of whatever they save once they move on from Ramsey can free up the cash to give Jonnu a new contract that makes sure they will still save cash this year, and they will obviously save cap. And Jonnu can get a new contract with a pay raise this year that's more in line with his peers. And I think he's got a really valid argument. It's where does the value lie? And you'll still save money. But if I'm the Dolphins, I'm probably coming to the negotiating table out of that list of 10 contracts that I just went through. And I'm starting with Tyler Higbee and I'm going through Gerald Everett. And I'm saying this is kind of where, Evan Ingram this year on the open market signed for 11.5. It's over 4%. It's kind of an outlier for an older player, for a guy that hasn't just been a generational, like Kittle, Kelce. Zach Ertz was arguably the best tight end in the league for a period of time. From a receiving profile perspective, we're not playing in that part of the sandbox, right? So the Higbees, the Henrys, the Hursts, the Geseckis, the Everetts, if you average all of those salaries together, the average of those salaries as a percentage of cap would be 3.18%. That's equivalent to about $8.9 million as an annual average salary basis. And that's where, none of those guys, one of those guys caught more than 65 balls. None of those guys broke 665 receiving yards. None of those guys had half as many touchdowns as what Jonnu had last year. I think if you're going to concede that Jonnu has a point, this is the floor, is probably 9. And 9 feels like a big number, but again, as a percentage of cap, he's amongst his peers there. If I'm Drew Rosenhaus, I'm pointing at Ertz and Evan Ingram, and I'm saying 4 or 5%. So if you use the 10 as a sliding scale, what happens if you say we should omit the top 3 and the bottom 3 names and look at places 4, 5, 6, and 7, kind of the median contracts? The average of those, and that would include the Ertz contract at 5% as an annual average, would be 4.12% of cap. That of this year's cap is equivalent to $11.51 million per season. That would just put him in front of Evan Ingram. It will put him 10th on the APY charts for contracts for tight ends. You can, if you want to fight real hard with Rosenhaus and say we should not include the Ertz contract, let's move the sliding scale down 1 additional contract. And now you're looking at places 5 through 8, which would then include the Evan Ingram contract still as the one lone one that's above 4%. That average moves from 4.12 when you bump Ertz out, and it moves down to 3.68%, which is good for 10.29. That would put him $40,000 per year in front of Juwan Johnson in New Orleans, who we have not mentioned, who's another player who signed, never had a career year last year, had 50 receptions, as was a college wide receiver, converted to tight end in 2021. He just signed for 10 and a quarter, and he had 50 for 500 yards and 5 touchdowns this year. And he's age 28. He's not a young player either. So none of these contracts are doing the Dolphins any favors to play hardball here. Now, you can play hardball and say, you signed the contract. You play. Come on, John, just play on the contract. But if the whole theme and the whole point is pay the right players, if you offloaded, say you ate $8 million of Jalen Ramsey's salary, just hypothetically, you still owe him 21. That still leaves $13 million in savings. You could give Jonnu Smith a raise, you could sign a corner, and you could still save money versus what you would have if you just kept Jalen Ramsey. And you can lock Jonnu Smith in. Of course, the concern is Mike McDaniel and his stability, so that's when I think you probably get into whatever you give him this year as in a signing bonus, and then maybe some of his salary for 2026 is injury guaranteed or guarantees on the 3rd day of the league year, so the Dolphins have an out if things go bad. And then there's no additional guaranteed money. That would be some of the strategy plus potentially performance incentives. Maybe you started at 9, you can go up to 11 if you repeat your production. There's a lot of ways that they can go here. There's a lot of tools at their disposal. But Jonnu Smith has a point. Jonnu Smith has a very fair argument relative to his peers and the production that they have. And as long as he's not going to sit here and hold your feet to the fire for 14 and I'm not budging, well, I think the Dolphins should meet him in the middle because there's room for good players on the team, and you want to reward players that buy into your system. Jonnu Smith's done that. He performed well, and I hope to see the Dolphins find some common ground, provided the price is right.